I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Sadly, news has emerged that 64-year-old Clare Marshall, who disappeared early on Monday morning, has been found in the River Tay near Moncrief Island. According to the Daily Mail, quote, no formal identification has taken place, but officers believe the woman to be Clare Marshall, who was reported missing from Perth early on Monday morning, the 18th of December. Officers have informed her family. There are no suspicious circumstances surrounding the death. Throughout the week, police officers had focused their search efforts along the banks of the river. Now, in some ways, the search for Clare Marshall has felt like a carbon copy of the search for Gaynor Lord and Nicola Bulley, and in many ways it is. But it's also been troubling how the search for Clare Marshall was different. There's been a virtual media and social media blackout. Why do you think that is? If Gaynor Lord was found in a third of the time it took to find Nicola Bulley, Clare Marshall was found in half the time it took to find Gaynor Lord. She was actually found yesterday. I must say, I actually thought this search might last weeks, given the size of this river, but of course we don't know the exact circumstances in terms of law enforcement. We don't know what they know. Clare was actually found on Thursday, that's yesterday, at around midday, meaning the search for Clare Marshall lasted barely 3 days, half the amount of time it took to find Gaynor. Although the news and social media has been mostly silent, folks in the area have communicated to me in comments mostly from videos that an intense search was nevertheless underway. So it's quite interesting. The strategy of law enforcement and of the media was just to keep this quiet. So I have a question for you. What is the appropriate way to deal with these stories? Nicola Bulley, Gaynor Lord, Clare Marshall. What's the right way? The Clare Marshall way? Or another way? Should we talk about it or not talk about it? Should we remember what happened to Nicola? And I sort of feel like what happened there isn't actually accurate. Should we try to learn from the still mysterious psychological circumstances surrounding Gaynor, or forget about it? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the many of you who have subscribed. I will be doing a very interesting analysis of John Douglas and his book and what he says about his experience in the Ramsey case. So look out for that. If you're enjoying this analysis, if you find it worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Now, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to see the pattern emerging here. And if you're just restricting your gaze to the Nicola Bulley case, and you're just looking at that case, then it's hard to see what's really going on. But then you see the Gaynor Lord case, and then you see this case. How many more cases do you need to see before you realize what's actually going on? A woman disappears near a river in circumstances the police say aren't suspicious. The police focus their search in the river, not on land. Days later, the woman is found in the river with no suspicious injuries. Also, this happens in the dead of winter, in the midst of the festive season. That's your fabric. That is the scenario that repeats. You also don't need to be a genius to see that it wasn't the first time police found themselves in a situation that's not suspicious, searching for a body in a river. I'm saying the police have been in this situation in Perth in terms of the River Tay before, in terms of the River Wyre before, in terms of the situation in Norwich before. While researching Clare Marshall, I found at least 2 other incidents that occurred in the same place. 6 years ago, it was Ian Guthrie who disappeared in Perth's Dundee Road on December 19th, same area. He was found almost 2 months later and 11 miles downstream. Police said there were no suspicious circumstances surrounding Guthrie's death either. So it took a long time to find him. Does that mean there was a cover-up, there was foul play, blah, blah, blah? The same applies to Gaynor Lord. 3 years before Gaynor's death, Clare Kerrison apparently headed towards the same river late at night at around 11 p.m. and never returned. In a rare bit of insight in terms of that case, it was revealed that Kerrison couldn't get over her mother's death less than 5 months earlier. At Kerrison's inquest, people were told how incredibly happy Kerrison was, that she never argued and had a wonderful marriage. People or kids at the school where she was I think a teaching assistant, were told to focus on the positive. What happens if you, I don't say focus on the negative, but if you look authentically at a person, you say, what wasn't so great? Where was maybe an area where someone was struggling? Was that person struggling? In the Nicola Bully case, it turned out a man had gone missing in the same area 45 years to the day, January 27. It wasn't treated as suspicious, although the circumstances were slightly different. It was a teenager, Roger Jones, who was thrown into the River Wyre after a motorbike accident. The 16-year-old wasn't found until 2 months later, in the river for 2 months. What do literally all of these cases have in common? It took a while to find the missing person in the river. Why? Not because of an incredible amount of intrigue, but because searching in water is a lot harder than searching on land. And I think there's an analogy to this idea of, I looked in the water, she's not in the water, I couldn't find her, so she's not in the water. And thus I know what is going on beneath the surface. And this idea that we know what's going on in other people's minds. We know what's going on in our minds. Because everything is superficial and shallow and easy to fathom. No. Some things are very difficult to fathom. Some ostensibly simple bodies of water are labyrinths. They look very simple and easy and are actually a lot more complicated beneath the surface. In the Nicola Bully case, we've seen how not helpful social hysteria can be, social media hysteria, in people seeing things that they project rather than seeing reality. Social media, especially true crime on YouTube, provides a kind of psychological mirror for the way a lot of people think, how they think as individuals, how they think as groups, and how the group think affects the individual. This is a kind of an allegory for the real world. How we think online, how we behave online is repeated on a larger scale out there in the world. And it's not always rational or realistic. It's often exaggerated, and when it's not exaggerated, it's minimized, which is to say, whatever reality is, whatever our perception is of reality, it tends to almost go to a default setting that is a distortion of that. And a lot of the people talking on YouTube are playing on those distortions, playing on those anxieties, telling you what you want to hear in order to be popular, rather than in a way that's truly helpful or authentic. We seem to be very good at looking at liars and manipulators in the true crime space. We're good at looking at that when it's someone else. We're very bad at understanding our own susceptibility to be in denial, to want to be told what we want to hear, and frankly, our intolerance for information that we don't want to hear. A lot of crimes are committed because a criminal refuses to accept reality. And that's something many of us share in common with criminals. It's a zone of weakness that we need to deal with. What happens then if we live in a half make-believe world where we decide things are whatever we decide things are, irrespective of the drier, duller scientific reality? And this is something I've noticed in true crime. Even folks that are supposedly on the side of truth and justice seem to be constantly tempted away from reality into whatever you want to call it, conspiracies, paths of least resistance in terms of thinking about certain things. What does this mean? This susceptibility to thinking about things not as they are, but as we are. Well, it means reality eventually catches up with us. No matter how deluded we are, whether we're purposefully running away from the truth or by accident or simply we're in a group that just thinks about certain things in a certain way, guess what? Reality is eventually going to catch up to you. And when it does, we are ill-equipped to deal with it. Even when we think we are dealing with reality, we can't seem to deal with it. I was appalled and disappointed that even when the bully case was investigated in a legal setting, in an inquest, they came up with a scenario that didn't make much sense. I've sat in on multiple murder cases where people don't want to look at the autopsy photos or don't want to show the autopsy photos because there is this difficulty. Even when you say we are here to deal with what happened, we don't seem to know how to deal with it. Is the accident scenario found by the coronial inquest in the bully case really the most logical explanation? And by that I'm not saying it's foul play. It's not foul play. Is the accident scenario in the Gaynor Lord case really the most logical? And by that I'm not saying, is it foul play? It's not foul play. Did Clare Marshall also fall into the river by accident? And I'm not trying to suggest that it's foul play. It's not foul play. If it's not foul play and it's not an accident, what is it? How about Ian Guthrie, Claire Kerrison, and Peter Baglin? How many times do you need to go through the same scenario before you see what's going on? And that then raises the obvious question, should we talk about it? If it's not foul play and this is a true crime channel, should we be talking about someone's motive, someone's psychologies, the dynamics, the evidence? In a gentle way, I've been trying to prod my community to get them to think critically about the clear psychological patterns underpinning these cases. Because there are some clear psychological patterns, not a lot, because a lot of this is hidden, it's private. People close to them don't want to talk about it, don't want to share anything about it. Nevertheless, those patterns are there. Of course, it's hard to do this when you're being drowned out by true crime opportunists that are trying to sell the sexier serial killer narrative or some popular, more exciting foul play derivative. It's also hard to do when family members don't want to say anything. Nicola Bulley, Gaynor Lord, and Clare Marshall were trying to deal with anxiety. Do you disagree? It's not very exciting or sexy or sensational. Like all of us, like you, like me, Nicola was trying to deal with her anxiety. Gaynor was trying to deal with her anxiety. Clare was trying to deal with her anxiety. They weren't trying to deal with a murderer. They weren't trying to deal with some shadowy figure. They were dealing with voices in their own minds. But we are a society that's not very good at anxiety either, in general. We're okay analyzing and lie detecting others. We're not very good at doing that to ourselves. And in a case like this, where someone was trying to deal with their own situation, that starts to cut a little bit too close to the bone, because what that does is it it exposes the anxiety that we're trying so hard to run away from. How good are we at sober analysis when there's so much lying to ourselves and each other going on? Sometimes we do need sober analysis. And that's kind of what this channel is for. And I know not everyone wants it. People want to feel good, want to feel entertained, want to perhaps run away from certain things. Social media is full of people running away from things. But if we fail to deal with anxiety, anxiety will eventually deal with us. Another word for anxiety is reality. Because no one wants to deal with it or knows how to, or once exposed by the chill undercurrents cutting through the festive season, we find ourselves on a lonely path. We're the only ones there, and there's little comfort and a lot of darkness. But we're actually not alone, because many people are feeling the same thing. They just don't say that they are. So should we? What do you think? Should we shine a light into those dark places? And one way to do that is simply to think about certain things that we don't want to, or that we avoid thinking about. Should we shine a light into those dark places? It is a place, admittedly, where angels fear to tread. It does take courage to face our own ghosts, or even to face the ghosts of Nicola's ghosts, Gainer's ghosts, Clare Kerrison's ghosts, Claire Marshall's ghosts. But the funny thing about fear is when you face, and facing is hard, but when you face it, it immediately starts becoming smaller. It immediately becomes a more manageable entity than whatever it was. It immediately begins to contract. Like a psychological mold, it germinates in the darkness. It begins in the psychological corners of our minds, and it thrives in the moisture of psychological denial and neglect. This is about anxiety. Anxiety is very easy to dodge. If you want to dodge it, easy. You don't think about it, easy. You can have a drink, easy. But over time, it builds up. And when it deals with you, are you prepared? Are you going to be able to deal with it? It's an uncomfortable conversation. It was for Nicola, it was for Gaynor, it was probably for Clare. Unless we have that conversation with ourselves, with each other, these patterns are going to repeat themselves. Before Nicola, Gaynor and Clare, there were other Nicolas, Gaynors and Clares. There don't need to be any more Nicola, Gaynors and Clares. So what do we do from here? Do we forget about it until it happens again? And then it happens, and then we forget about it again, because there's already an amnesia setting in very quickly after Gaynor Lord. Something is wrong with society. And people are psychologically vulnerable over the festive season. Is that so hard to say? Is that so hard to accept? Not everyone is having their Merry Christmas fairy tale. Not everyone is prepped and ready for a Happy New Year. Some are, some aren't. At the very least, we should be more aware of our own thinking and those around us. Because being authentically happy is also about knowing when to deal with things that aren't so good. Sometimes it's important to be positive, but not at the expense of reality. Not being positive in a sort of thriving delusion, a delusion of thriving, where that is a kind of a tyranny, where you totally drown out any other thinking. By the same token, you don't focus just on the bad stuff, but keeping up appearances of happiness, which seems to be a default setting. You see it so often in true crime. It seems to be something that may have been the case with Nicola and Gaynor. It's damaging, keeping up an appearance of happiness when underneath that is something raw that is going on. How do you deal with that part? That part that's beneath the surface, that's harder to talk about. Because if you never deal with it, if you constantly are feeding the mask and putting up a mask, that's a path to psychological ruin. Putting up a public face and putting everything into that public face means the private face becomes neglected, becomes, in a sense, weaker. As I say, focusing on everything that's wrong in the world isn't the right way to go about it either. We must find our way to a happy medium, one that's realistic, one that's anchored in reality, but also manageable. There's also such a thing as too much reality, but equally, I think for most people, there's too little reality. That only happens when we are prepared to be conscious and self-aware, and part of that self-awareness is knowing our proclivity for denial. If that's something you need to work on, welcome to this channel, because that is where we work on it. This is where we work on it. Like anything, living in the real world, mastery of the real world takes time and practice. The more we allow ourselves to experience reality, the greater our agency becomes. Each time our agency expands in increments. And that's how the river then recedes before us. And the dark horizon softens, allowing the light to break through. And the blue sky, we find our way to the blue sky once more. And we find the sun is shining. And it radiates into us like sun into leaves. That's always possible, but you can only get to that place by living authentically. Thank you for listening. Look out for my next video dealing with John Douglas, the profiler, and his experience in the Ramsey case. If you are having any feelings of sadness or difficulty over this period, just know that you're not alone. Maybe reach out to someone. If you're someone who suspects you know someone who's feeling a little bit down, a little bit sad, a little bit lonely, maybe reach out to them. Take care, and I'll see you guys next time.